Welcome to today's episode of the Medical Device Marketing Podcast. So this is the next episode in our new series where we talk to consultants in the medical device space about how we can become better medical device marketers each day. Today we've got Sabira Hyderali and Guy Pascoe from Purdy Pascoe. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia.
So to start off with, and if people haven't listened to the first episode, Guy, can you explain a little bit more to our audience what you do and who you are?
Thanks, Claudia. Yes, so Guy Pascoe, I'm one of the two founders of Purdy Pascoe, along with Marianne. I've been in the industry for, I think, 20 years, having started off as a management consultant, worked for a larger agency for a few years, and then, as I said, Marianne and I set up Purdy Pascoe about 15 years ago, doing qualitative and quantitative primary market research for the medtech industry.
Sabira, over to you.
Sabira Hyderali. I head up the MedTech division for Purdy Pascoe. I've been in a marketing research role for well over 30 years, so career market researcher, specializing in healthcare. The majority of those roles I've spent in medical device and diagnostics. I've been in a variety of roles over the course of my career. So I started off in more traditional primary market research. I've been in a pricing and forecasting role. I've also been in communications. So I do a lot of work in messaging and positioning, which is something I really enjoy.
And very relevant to everybody listening to this podcast as well. So welcome to both of you to today. So the first question, actually not the first question, it is the first question, but so something that came up after the last episode that we did, we were talking about primary market research, and it did come to mind, and actually it came to other people's minds as well. We were sent a message about what is secondary market research, and is there such a thing? Guy?
Yeah, that absolutely is. And sorry, we probably use that term primary market research without really thinking about it, because that's our sort of daily bread and butter. So primary market research is going to customers directly, asking them questions, whether it's through an interview or online survey, whatever it might be. Secondary market research is really using already available data sources that have been compiled through sales data or desk research, whatever sources they might come from. And the bottom line is actually there's not much of it in the medtech industry, infamously little. You probably will find something. But if, for example, you wanted to know the size of the dental implant market in Turkey, you might get the size of the toothbrush market in Greece. So, you might get lucky, but chances are you won't get your answers off the shelf.
And so these are the reports that analytic companies and things like that will create, which has market data in it. So the size of the cardiovascular market and the size of things like that.
Yeah, and many of them are written, many of them are extremely useful for their chosen audience. Don't get me wrong, they're amazing resources for design for people who buy them off the shelf. But that for someone who just needs to answer a question out of the blue, they're unlikely to find what they need through that source.
So they're not specific, I suppose.
Correct. They're also syndicated. So they are written for a wide variety of clients, customers. So there is an element of generalization in those reports which may not serve a client's needs.
That makes sense. So a lot more targeted, personalized is where primary market research sits. Yeah. Fab. Okay, so what we're going to talk about on this episode of the podcast is really breaking market research down into how it fits into the product life cycle. So there's probably listeners to this podcast now who are, in smaller companies and their products are at different stages, or they're in larger companies, with a well-established product. So I'd really like to go through each stage and find out, what can we do from a market research perspective to help speed up the adoption of a technology when it does come to market. So it makes sense to me to start right at the beginning. So if we start first of all, before we do that, let's make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So product life cycle. So we understand one thing as a product life cycle as marketers, and it may be exactly the same thing, but I just wanted to make sure we're talking about the same things. Sabira, how would you define the product life cycle as you see it in market research?
So starting off at the beginning, right, you're developing your product. Once you've developed your product, and again, there may be iterative development cycles of that, then you need to validate it. You need to essentially validate that your product is meeting your customers' needs. It's attractive. It's going to be adopted. So market research comes into play there. Then you're seeking regulatory approval. There may be stringent criteria that you may have to meet. From there, you are working towards market launch. So understanding your messaging, your claims, and all of the tactics and strategies that is going to effectively get your product to market. And then, of course, post-market commercialization. So ensuring that your product is successful in market once it's launched.
So if we go, and Gar, I'll come to you for this one. So if we go right back to the beginning of the life cycle that Sabira spoke about, when we talk about pre-concept and concept development, what should marketers be thinking about from a market research perspective?
Most likely qualitative research, because that's the stage where you're going to be really exploring that need for your product, finding out what people are feeling about today's products, getting some really in-depth reaction to your ideas, seeing how they react, how they test with your potential customers. So qualitative is probably the first step.
And this is before you have any prototypes or anything, you'll likely just have a concept, an idea, and this is the market you want to go into.
Can be anything. I mean, we've tested everything from literally an idea on a piece of paper, just a paragraph, to a full-blown prototype. But probably at that early stage, it's an idea, maybe a diagram. Sometimes videos are very powerful, as we know.
And when you say videos, what type of videos would you normally show market research?
Yeah, just a mocked up and description of something, a new injector, whatever it might be. Just anything that gives someone the idea of the mode of action is more powerful than something just on the.
So a really basic animation. This is how we anticipate it would be.
And that's what I love. That's what really.
I think the more disruptive the technology is, where we encourage our clients to think about augmenting the concept. And so anything visual is usually well received by clinicians, especially.
Well, actually, that makes total sense, because we see in marketing as well that videos or animations are digested 66,000 times faster by the brain than text alone. So you can see how, and medical devices are not simple often, are they? So actually, animations can make a huge amount of difference. So how early in this pre-concept phase, how early should people start looking at market research, especially if there's a disruptive technology? Because I see the value of almost like, it's sort of like agile feedback, isn't it? So you keep iterating. How early do you think people should start looking at market research?
I mean, I don't think there is a too early. I think right from the get-go, because that's where your dollars or your currency is being invested. So don't lose time, get the answers quickly. And so that as you iterate, again, it goes back to understanding what your customers need. So we talk about minimally viable products. At minimum, what do your clients need or your customers need? And then over and above that, what is going to delight them? What's going to move the needle, right? What's going to increase the excitement in the environment?
Yes. Guy, would you add anything to that?
I think the only thing I'd add is if you're convinced you've got a brilliant idea and you ask people and they tell you it's a terrible idea, just listen to why they're saying that, because maybe they just don't understand it. Maybe you haven't explained it very clearly.
That's a really great point.
Yeah, I think that's worth bearing in mind.
Yeah. Okay, so is there anything you would say, in addition to what we've spoken about people who are in pre-concept and sort of concept development phase, anything else they should be thinking about?
I would say include all stakeholders. So think about clinicians, think about patients, think about, and even within clinicians, I think one mistake I see commonly is let's just go and talk to the surgeons or the key clinicians in the hospital who are doing the majority of the procedures. But you sometimes forget that there are newer clinicians, newer to practice, who may be struggling, or patients who have a voice, caregivers, nurses are becoming increasingly more important for adoption. So look at it as a multi-stakeholder approach.
I was just going to add to that, Sabira. I'm sure, in our lifetimes as market researchers, I think we've seen that change in the States with surgeons in particular, because when I started off, I don't know about the majority, but a lot of surgeons I speak to will be self-employed. If they like the product, they could effectively leverage their power at the hospital and say, that's what I want to use.
But I think that was the same in the NHS years and years ago.
Yeah.
I think you're right. Things are absolutely changing now. I think one thing that we see, and I don't know if you're seeing more market research in this area, but actually talking to, and we did speak about it a little bit at the beginning, but talking to business managers, because that is the biggest block we see. Because, clinicians, you can have a device that really meets all the requirements of the clinician, but now there's so many more stakeholders in every healthcare system that you need to go through in order to get adoption of your technology. And so it seems to me like that would be a very good place for market research to start as well.
Yes, undoubtedly, with the caveat again. Yeah. So if you're talking to people whose currency is money and purchasing, they may not understand what the clinical offering that you're bringing to market is. They just know that it's more expensive, and that's a bad thing. So you need to hear that. You need to be aware of it and find out what would make it attractive. Yeah. Again, what metric is
then the problem you're solving for them.
Yeah, but you kind of the clinical side of things to find out, what is the message, what is the benefit we're bringing, and then the kind of business perspective effectively to say, how do I actually get that paid for?
Yeah. But what I'm hearing is the most amount of information, as much information as you can get, is good information in the early stages.
Yes, absolutely. And again, that multi-stakeholder, because there is more than one stakeholder who is impacting the purchase and adoption of your product.
Yeah, so get it right from the start. Okay, so moving forward onto product development and then pre-launch. So when I talk about pre-launch, I'm meaning just up until the point you launch. So what are the things that people need to think about in that stage of their product development, Spira?
I mean, there is understanding your market segments. There is understanding positioning. I think positioning is such an important piece of market research. And when I say positioning, what I mean is where the product exists in the mind of your customers. So is it perceived as unique? Does it have distinct benefits and values? Is it differentiated from your competition? Because if it's not, it's going to be challenging in terms of sustaining and adopting. So spending time thinking and talking to customers to really understand where your product exists in their mind space is really important.
And that's possible even though you haven't launched it yet?
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely.
Do you have any examples of technologies that are now out in the market that fit this criteria extremely well, or that you've seen coming through? Just to put a sort of a picture to it.
In terms of positioning, I would say robotics is a big one. When robotics first started, and I remember back in the day, so I'm going back a number of years now, robotics was a very scary concept to a surgeon, because there was an element of them giving up some autonomy. And through working and talking to surgeons, I think manufacturers of robotics learned how to position their products so that it was something that was enabling a surgeon and not necessarily taking away power from them. And that was all due to some really good and putting in the work.
So it's really understanding the issues and fears of your audience, and then addressing those in how you're positioning it to them. So, but so talking about the sort of the pre-commercial side and the positioning, what other things that can people look at, or do people need to start thinking about in this stage before they get to launch? So, what other market research can they think about?
There's some other obvious ones, like simply how big is this opportunity, and that's clearly quantitative research. Who are the competitors? What do people think of the competitors? What's their positioning?
So should this not be being done much earlier, or is there value doing it again just before launch because things could have changed?
It's a good question. I would say early on you want to have some idea of the market and the market landscape, as it were. But probably you've then been focusing somewhat more on your own product, and then it's time to really understand, who are the big beasts in the marketplace. Who you're going to have to dislodge, what's their messaging, their positioning, where are you going to compete, where are you perhaps weak against them, and being at least prepared for that and aware of that.
Yeah. And actually, so even though we're talking about positioning, You're talking, Guy, you're already bringing up messaging as well. So actually that's a really important thing you need to consider because, so obviously once you start getting to regulatory approval, you have your intended purpose, you know what claims have been approved and what you can say. But that doesn't mean you actually know how to go out to market with them.
It's a classic medical device thing. Most of the products we see our clients bringing to market don't just have one improvement. They've often got 4 or 5 more improvements, which are great. And they will know that some of those are groundbreaking potentially and some are bells and whistles. But you want to check what your customers think because it's not always the ones that you think are.
That's it, isn't it?
Yeah,
and especially if you've been so invested in this technology for so long, and actually then you might think certain things are really important, but when you speak to people, that's not what matters.
I'm going to come up with an example from a completely different industry, but I used to be in the telecoms industry, and we were very excited for the first internet phone that came out. You could suddenly, check the news on your phone, and in fact, everyone loved it. It was a big seller, Nokia 9110, that believers will remember. But really, it was a big seller because if you pressed a button, the microphone popped out like a bat phone, and everyone loved it. And that wasn't at all what they intended to be the main selling point. That happens in medical devices the whole time.
But if they had have asked people, they would have known immediately that's what it was, and that's what then could have gone into all their advertising, all their paid ads, all their materials.
That's right.
Yeah.
Amazing. That's a really good example. Fab. Okay, so moving forward, is there anything else you would add, either of you? Is there anything else you would add to this stage? So going up to commercialization. So we've had testing of messaging, positioning, understanding your competitive landscape. Is there anything else you...
I think pricing research comes into play before commercialization. And it's when we think about research and pricing, it's value-based pricing. So it's always attributed to what is the perceived value of the product. And again, going back to something I said earlier, that is maybe where you want to get the healthcare decision makers into the mix, in addition to those clinician influencers as well, and patients where appropriate.
But actually, interestingly, even if your pricing is already set, which it might not be yet because it's not quite the same as pharmaceutical, but even if it is set, actually you then know what resistance you're going to get from the market. So, and then you know how to address that, which is a really interesting, because the other option, I suppose, is you go out with your sales team, you meet this resistance, and it takes loads longer to get over it. Whereas if you knew this resistance was coming up front, or it's not there, whichever way, you know the pathway forward from a marketing perspective as well. So that's really great information for marketers.
Yeah, and what can you do to mitigate the resistance? Yes. You may not be able to change your product.
Yeah.
So are there other services that you need to bring in? Is there other support that you have to bring in? Or have you fallen short in terms of your messaging and your positioning? Are they not seeing the value that you think this product and it demands?
All gives you information for next steps, doesn't it? Yeah. So information is power in this situation. Okay, so moving forward, this is an interesting area. Post-launch, post-launch and post-market. Guy?
Well, we do get asked to do research post-market, not infrequently. And one of the main reasons would be, why is my product not doing as well as I thought it was going to? Again, looking at the messaging and seeing if things are not coming through clearly. So much the same as a pre-launch type of thing.
And would that be qualitative research, or would you do that in quantitative? How would you do that?
Probably ideally a bit of both. Qualitative to understand what the issues are that people are having, and then quantitative to work out which ones are really meaningful in terms of scale. Both methodologies could come into play at that point. There's a different kind of research we do post-market as well, which we touched on earlier, but it's I'm sure many of your listeners will be very familiar with the EU MDR, which has been sort of around as a concept and as a reality for many years, and a reality for the last couple of years. We've been working with clients for the last, I think, 5 or 6 years, helping them get ready to meet their EU MDR obligations, and in particular doing the PMCF survey bit of it. So effectively using market research to collect safety data from your customers to satisfy the needs of the notified bodies with great success. It's been a very well received way of meeting those obligations.
And that would be quantitative?
That's all quantitative. Yeah, all quantitative, all in Europe, nearly all in Europe, with some more rarely used devices, we've been able to use data from other markets as well. And we've got a dedicated team who focus just on that.
Yeah. Anything you would add on that, Sabera?
No, I think that captures it. I mean, that is, well, actually, that is the PMCF side of it. But you do need to follow your customers. So the mistake that, again, I see very often is the product is in market and the perception is the product is just going to sell itself. And you're forgetting that, competitors are now having to deal with your product and their messaging. They've got counter messaging. You also don't know whether the product is meeting expectations, whether all of your other offerings that have to do with training, with service, with integration, so many things that really impact facilities.
It's so interesting you say all this, though, because, we talk very much to companies about the reason customers don't move through their buyer's journey is because of issues, fears, and concerns they have. And it's like whenever you have an issue, fear, or concern, you turn away from what you're doing or you lose interest, and it just slows down the whole journey. So actually, it's exactly the same. So if you don't understand why your audience is doing that, then you're never going to be able to rectify it. And market research is a great way to do that on an ongoing basis once you're in the market. And, we speak to sales teams and they're a fantastic source of knowledge for that. But again, it's not that unbiased source of knowledge. And you'll probably find out other things that you didn't realize when you speak to, when you do market research and qualitative market research.
Any new product is going to change the day-to-day, right, of a facility, of a practice. And some of them can be measurable changes. So any change to day-to-day workflow, efficiencies, communication, collaboration, those can be pain points. So you really need to check in with your customers.
Yeah, and we've touched on it a few times, but actually there's so many different stakeholders who could be at play and thinking of medical devices. We talk a lot to nurses, for example. They may be the people who really use a device more than anyone else. But then you've got people like biomedical engineers who might be responsible for maintaining and looking at the warranty and those kind of factors that you don't think of the whole time, but they could be really critical for someone.
And these could all be blockages to your technology being adopted. Yeah. It's really interesting. So obviously there's lots of different countries in the world. How does market research differ from country to country?
There are some key differences, and there's some cultural ones, and they can get overplayed. But, for example, we were always told for years that you shouldn't run focus groups in Japan because culturally they were complex and problematic. Times change, so we keep a close eye to make sure if these kind of shibboleths are still true. But there are some things that we do observe over many years of experience. So, for example, if you're giving something a good old rating out of 10, what the Brits might give a 7 might be a 6 or even a 5 in Germany, but the Italians might call it a 9, even though they all like it about the same amount. I exaggerate, the differences aren't that big, but we keep a normative database and we can observe little differences.
So we're middle in positivity.
For Europe, we're kind of in the middle.
Yeah.
In the middle. But there's also differences to the way that...
So how do you calibrate against that? How do you see that happening? Is it like across the board? It just people know this? Or
you know it from qualitative research because you know when a German says, that's a fantastic product, I'll give it a 6 out of 10.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, but it couldn't be better.
There are also market research techniques that accommodate the differences in scaling.
Yeah.
So for instance, if you are doing a global study, you may choose to have fewer rating scales where maybe the Italians and the Spanish are going to rate high and the Germans probably not so high, right? So there are other techniques like trade-off techniques or, point allocations where you tend to minimize the differences. But I do think that brings up a good point in terms of just global research and making sure that you're not looking at a region as a region, that there truly are country differences. So, don't look at it as just the EU. The Germans are different from the, French and the Spanish, and not only culturally, but even just in terms of the economics and regulation.
It's complex.
It's a really good point. And I don't want to get too much into the nuts and bolts of it, but Sabera raises the idea of trade-off exercises, and they're common in any kind of market research. But I think in medical device, they're particularly relevant because that is the reality. A lot of what you can design, there are trade-offs in the R&D. There's trade-offs in obviously affordability. So the most classic of all would be a good old pacemaker. It can be smaller or it can last longer. It can't do both. Well, increasingly, it maybe can do both. But those kind of trade-offs are very real, and they're great ways to test people's interest in different features. Again, especially when you've got multiple features that you can do, or indeed you maybe have done, and you're trying to work out which ones really matter to people.
That's interesting. Yeah. And what about stakeholders? So how do stakeholders vary? As we know that countries vary. So is there a difference that you see within one country of their stakeholders?
So I think there are differences in the influence of stakeholders, country to country. I think there are
what do you mean by that?
So for instance, in the US, for example, nurses play, I think, a much bigger role than perhaps we see outside of the US, where patients will rely more on a physician, a surgeon. I think there's a dynamic in the US where, because of our healthcare system, patients will often see a nurse or what is called a physician's assistant as their primary care. So there's understanding that and then including those stakeholders appropriately as you're researching in each country.
So that's not really saying that that different stakeholders respond differently. It's more, which we've been talking about over the podcast, is it's actually making sure you understand what the role of each stakeholder is in each geography.
That, as well as responding differently, because nurses tend to be more patient-centric, more patient-sensitive. A physician may say, I am going to recommend this to a patient, and a nurse may turn around and say, well, hang on, that patient is not going to accept this for X, Y, and Z reason. And the physician just doesn't know because the conversation is being had with the nurse, the difficulty that patient has encountered. Those conversations are typically with a nurse.
So you're going to get a lot better understanding which stakeholders are doing what. You're going to get a different answer. Yeah, and more information, as we always said, is good.
And it's a good point. Again, remembering that a lot of the stuff that we work on is tertiary care, effectively. There's a number of different stakeholders. There's going back to the UK, you've got a GP in the mix as well as a sort of gatekeeper. You've got, a secondary physician, you've got tertiary physician, let alone all the other auxiliary roles that can be critical that we've mentioned already.
Mm-hmm. So what you've been doing market research, both of you have been doing market research for quite a long time now, as we've been doing marketing for quite a long time now. What are the common pitfalls you see people doing, or you see when people don't do market research?
Well, I'm going to quickly start with one that happens when people do market research, but it's an afterthought. And someone said, hey, has anyone actually done this research? Have we done any market research? No, better check that box. And I'm sure Sabera could think of times where we've had to bring the bad news and say, listen, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid this product is not going to fly. And they say, thanks, guy, it's launching on Tuesday. And
so all that money has gone into it. The sales force is probably ready to go. And it's a critical failure.
And again, it may be that actually the product hasn't been explained properly. There's lots of different things that could be at play. It could still be a successful product eventually, but it's not going to do well.
It is like if it's not been explained well. So it's, if you don't have your messaging right, as simple as that, or you don't have your positioning right, you might have your positioning right, but it's not explained clearly enough, and your messaging is too complicated, and it comes back with this just won't work.
Yeah. So I think what we're all talking about is mitigating risk, right? That is really where market research comes in, is that mitigating risk.
Very important. When so much is at stake with medical device, from, not only getting technologies to patients as quickly as possible, but the benefits they can make. So really important. And the money that goes into them as well. Okay, so it'd be great to finish on some amazing market research success stories. Can I ask each of you to talk about a success story that might inspire our listeners? Guy, can I start with you?
You can, absolutely. So, one comes to mind for me, and I can only talk in broad terms, of course, but our client has a portfolio of products in one area, and they're the leader in many of those products, and very innovative, great, interesting new products. But one product in particular was very much a Me Too value competitor, and they were very comfortable with that. But what they hadn't worked out is that product was really bringing down the perception of the rest of their wonderful products. And for years and years, they'd been selling it with this conception that it was good enough, and people hated it. And it had this kind of reverse halo effect, whatever that would be. I haven't got the right term.
So it's negative brand association.
And they couldn't work out that they hadn't worked out that there's a negative brand association, much more professionally put, as I would expect. And once we convinced them that they just had to compete on a different level in that product, everything got a lift up. So it was rather different to the kind of new product launch.
But it's interesting. No, but it's interesting because that's actually obviously post-market or post-market release. But it sounds really obvious now you say it. Like actually it was just one product causing a problem, but actually you'd never have known if you hadn't gone and tested it. So that's really, and then the uplift that comes to all the others is fantastic. Sabera, can I come back to you?
So one that comes to mind immediately is something I did years ago, and it was the way that the product was being sold. So different from a large competitor in the market, this company was second to market and made the assumption that because there was a first to market product, that the market was primed for their product, and all they had to do was simply just place it in the hand of their surgeons. What they didn't know was the competitor, once they put the product in the hands of the surgeon, then spent almost 3 weeks in the procedure room, training the surgeons, watching them, giving them feedback on the procedure, because the procedure was quite difficult. And when this company came to market and neglected to do that, as you can imagine, their contracts were not renewed. They thought it was the fault of the product, and it wasn't. It was just simply the miss on staying with the surgeon and educating them and training them. So they lost all of their contracts. We did some market research. We identified the issue. They put a training program in place that was more robust than the first to market company. And within a year, their product had taken off.
Wow. So that was all to do with training.
And that was all to do with training. And it was never something that had gotten back to them, because the hospitals just assumed that they weren't doing the training because they simply couldn't afford it.
So if you were going to look back on that, and anybody listening to this podcast, sort of thinking about how could I have not got that, how could that situation not have happened to me, or how do I prevent that from happening again? What would be your advice to people to stop that happening? Because I bet that happens, more than people realize.
Keep talking to your customers.
Yeah.
Keep talking to your customers and use primary market research to understand your customers and follow them throughout the journey.
I suppose what I'm hearing from everything that we're talking about now, because I understand market research a lot better than I did before, obviously because we've had all our calls beforehand as well. But it's actually have a market research strategy, in the sense, understand what you need to do at every stage of your product development. And it might not all be right for you. You might not have the budgets to do it all, but actually understand everything that's available to you. And so that you can be like, I think that makes sense for us now because of this situation, or that because of this situation. And then at least you have a good strategy to stop these things happening in the future.
Yeah. I mean, the example that I gave was one where if they had done some research and even understood the standard of care, right, the competitive space, they would have known what their competitors were doing.
And the nice thing is, you guys and any other, market research agency who is dedicated to medical device, this is all you do. So, you're a great source of information for companies to really be able to understand, actually, how can we maximize the use of market research for our product, our specific product lifecycle that we have here now.
Yeah, one other thing I'd add, Claudia, is that market research in the medical device industry, I think we'd say, is compared to pharmaceutical industry, is relatively kind of undeveloped, unfunded. less formalized, and only the biggest companies, and not even all of them, really have a dedicated market research function. And many quite large companies really leave it in the hands of product managers, marketing managers. It can be very fragmented, and that's the reality. But I think if you can't afford a market research specialist within your company to kind of manage all of that, do at least find some way of making sure there's a central repository that everyone knows is there, that everyone can access. Because one of the first questions we always ask is, what other research have you already done? And sadly for us, sometimes they find they've already got a great bit of research they'd forgotten about from 6 months ago, or didn't know about, for example.
So when you talk about central repository, you mean somewhere that any market research you've ever done, you put it in one place so everybody can find it.
Exactly, which should be easier these days with better IT systems. It shouldn't be such a challenge. But we worry sometimes at how much market research can get wasted because you deliver it to a team, the team breaks up, and it's kind of forgotten about. And we love to see what we do bearing fruit and coming to fruition. And we love it when people say, we're still using that report that you did, last year, we're still referring back to it. That's music to our ears. What we hate is the idea that it floats off into ether, ticks a box, and isn't used again.
That's a great bit.
That's a waste.
Great bit of advice.
Yep.
What's the most important thing medical device marketers could know about market research and how it can help them?
You're a fly on the wall in a customer's life. I mean, that's it. It's just that knowledge, that really intimate knowledge of knowing your customers' pain points, their needs, their desires, their wants.
Guy, would you add anything?
No, everybody. I think I can.
I think that's very. No, I can picture it. As soon as Sabera said that, I can totally picture it. And you can get so much information from being a fly on the wall and understanding what everybody's saying. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on both of these episodes.
Thanks for having us.
Well, no, it's been an absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. So we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Medical Device Marketing Podcast and have learned more about market research and how it can help you as medical device marketers to do a better job each and every day. So market research certainly isn't a one-time thing. It's something that should be done throughout your product lifecycle to iterate everything from messaging to positioning to product development. So if you want to know more about market research, contact Purdy Pascoe or visit their website on www.purdypascoe.com. I hope you have a fantastic day and look forward to seeing you on the next Medical Device Marketing Podcast.